Greetings, I'm Professor K, and in this short video presentation, we're going to take a look at how we go about preparing our network for the installation of Active Directory. Hopefully you have gone through the first half of the lab file so that you can understand exactly what it is I am doing and why I am doing it inside of this video. In this first portion, or the first half of the lab file, I go over about choosing the right domain name, using alternatives to .local, and why we need to use subdomains as opposed to using a domain that is not available on the internet. So I'm going to cover all that in the first half of the lab, so make sure you go through it. And then later on, when we get ready for this video, there is the second half of the lab that you can use to follow along to see exactly what it is I'm doing up here in preparation of preparing my first domain controller for the installation of Active Directory on my network. Hopefully by now you have come to realize that there's more to just installing a server and promoting it to a domain controller. We have to design our network from the bottom up, and we have to make sure that we design it right the first time, or we'll be coming back in 6 months from now and we'll be redoing it, and we don't want to have to do that. So I now have my naming convention, I now have my IP scheme, and so we're now ready to prepare this machine to become the first domain controller of our new domain. The first thing we're going to do is rename the machine to something that makes sense so that I can recognize this machine as being a domain controller once it has been promoted. To do this, I'm up inside of Server Manager, and I'm inside of the local server settings, and I'm going to go where it says computer name, and I'm just going to click it. That brings up the system properties. Here I can click on the change button. I'm now ready to rename this machine to something that makes sense and will identify this machine as being a domain controller on my network. Since this machine is going to be the first domain controller of the forest, I'm going to name it DC1. I can now say OK, and I get a warning that I'm going to have to restart for the changes to take effect. I'm going to say OK to that. I'm going to say close, and now it wants to know if I want to restart. I'll go ahead and restart. When we come back up, we're going to configure this machine with a static IP address. Most small to medium-sized networks will be able to use a Class C network. So in this case, for my lab, I'm going to use a Class C block of 192.168.145.0. That is the network portion of my IP addressing scheme for this particular network. Since I have a subnet mask with the first 3 octets full, that leaves me the 4th octet for host IP addressing. That means that I have approximately 254 IP addresses that I can use to assign a host IP to the devices on my network. For the ease of administration, I like to assign the first IP available for hosting an IP address to the default gateway, which is the Ethernet interface of my firewall. I like to break out the remaining IP addresses in blocks and assign those blocks to specific types of devices. For instance, I'm going to use IP address 1 through 9 for my networking devices. This includes my firewall, this includes my switches. If I have an IDS, IPS, I'll use an IP address from that range for there. For my servers, I have set aside the block of host IPs starting with .10 and running all the way up to .19. Now, I only have a few servers, but I'm expecting growth, or I am planning for growth. So I want to make sure that I have enough IP addresses in this block to accommodate any additional servers that may come along within the next 5 to 6 years. The same thing with my printers. For my printers, I have set aside the hosting IPs of .20 all the way up to .29. That leaves me, for my workstations, the host IP starting at .30 all the way up to 254. That's how I am going to design my network. Now, how you design yours is up to you, but make sure that you do plan for growth. The rule of thumb is to at least allow for 50% growth in each one of those areas. My server is back up. I have Server Manager open. I'm going to go to local server, and just as soon as this refreshes, we'll be able to go in and configure this machine with a static IP. Now, there are a number of ways for me to access the networking adapter and get into the IP4 properties to assign a static IP, but this is one of the easiest. So I'm just going to again go inside of the properties for my local server. I'm just going to click it once, and that brings up my network properties, and I'm going to right click on the network adapter that I have present, go to properties, scroll on down here to TCP IP4, just double click it, and you'll see that I'm currently receiving a dynamic IP from the DHCP server for whatever software emulator I'm using. In this case it's VirtualBox, but it would be the same if I was using VMware. So the first thing I want to do is configure this adapter for a static IP address, and I'm going to tell it to use the following IP address. I'm now going to type in the networking portion of my IP address, and then I will assign a host IP. So I have typed in the networking portion of my IP address into the block for the IP address for this adapter. I'm now going to assign the first available IP address from the block of IPs that I have set aside for my servers, and that is .10. I'm now going to use the tab key, come on down one time. That fills in the subnet mask, and the rest of this I can leave blank, because when I promote this machine to a domain controller, it won't find DNS, so it's going to install it for me automatically. When it does that, it will then assign a loopback address to its preferred DNS server address on this adapter. I'm going to say OK to that, OK to this, close out my network adapters, and that brings me right back to Server Manager. Now I'll do a refresh, and you'll see that I have a static IP address of 192.168.145.10. Now you need to make sure before you get into the promotion state that you have everything in here exactly the way you want it. On a side note, if this build was for a client, I would have had all the hardware shipped to my office. I would have then configured all those devices correctly with the information that I need for that client's network. I would then rebox everything, either FedEx it over to the client's site, or I would throw it in the back of my truck and drive it on over and set up the network. No need to spend 2 or 3 days at the client's site installing operating systems and doing all that fun stuff when you can do it in your office. That concludes this short video presentation on how we go about preparing our network for the installation of Active Directory. And if you have any questions or you have any concerns about any of the material that was covered in this video or the lab, please don't hesitate to reach out and contact your instructor, and I'll see you in my next video.